I'm really delighted to be here in this fantastic museum, which I had the great pleasure of seeing for the first time yesterday, being shown round by the leadership team who are in the front row here, and I'm hugely impressed with what you've done, and I want to come back and spend a whole day going round it and listening to the guides in some of those 24 languages. I'm not going to talk directly about the museum. I'm going to talk about the research project that I am just starting at Oxford, which I hope will end in at least one book, which connects very closely to the subject of this museum. And the working title for that project, as you said, is "What Story Should Europe Tell?" ? But of course, each of those 5 words itself raises a whole bunch of questions which have to be asked. And let me take it word by word and indicate just a few of the questions that immediately arise. So first of all, the word should. Why should? Why should Europe tell its story? Why does it need to tell its story? Is it Santayana's famous comment that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it? Is that the basic reason? But is that necessarily a story by which we understand something like a narrative? Hegel, I'm sure you've all read Hegel's Studies in the Philosophy of History, which is not, I have to say, light reading, but is well worth reading. And at one point he says in there, it's one of his main points, that it is the state which creates the need for history, for narrative, because you have, so to speak, the subject, which in his view is the state, and then you have to explain how it came to be there, and to some extent why it came to be there. And so one way of thinking about the European story is to ask what's the subject of that story, and I'll come to that in a moment. But there is a problem here, and the problem is the tension, although we use the same word in many languages for story and history. Storia, Historia, Geschichte, Geschichte. There is a major tension between at least the traditional ideas of a narrative as told in national contexts and history as what historians do. And this is, of course, brilliantly captured in Ernest Renan's great essay, What is a Nation? Where, as you all know, he says a nation is a community of shared remembering, but also of shared forgetting, and then has the famous formulation that every Frenchman or Frenchwoman, I think he says every Frenchman, but let's say now Frenchman and Frenchwoman, has to have forgotten the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It's a wonderful formulation. So you know about it, but then you have to have forgotten about it. And he goes on to say that historians are therefore a great danger to the life of nations, because their job is to remind you of the things that you should have forgotten, like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, to complicate the story. Actually, as Margaret Macmillan says, the job of historians is to be myth-busters. So you have that tension between the narrative, which has to be in some sense a simple and preferably an inspiring story, because that's part of the point of the narrative, and history in what historians do, which is to complicate and subvert all myths. And so one of the questions of my project, the central questions of the project, is there a way of telling the European story which is compatible with the duty of the historian, to stick to the facts, to respect the complexity of the story, to subvert the simplistic myth? Is there a way of combining the two? So please have that in mind as we go through the sentence which is on the screen. Now, secondly, there is the word Europe. What on earth does that mean? It may sound simple, but it's not simple at all. Europe is at least three things or groups of things. First of all, it's a continent. It's a geographical expression, but a continent with very ill-defined frontiers. The only one of Europe's frontiers which is really well defined is the one to the north, because that's the North Pole. To the east and southeast, Europe does not end. It merely fades away across the vast expanse of what is now Russia and across Turkey. Somewhere between St. Petersburg and Vladivostok, Europe probably ends. Somewhere between Istanbul and Tehran, Europe probably ends. To the south, it's not well defined at all, because after all, for centuries, for classical antiquity, the North African coast was much more part of the civilized world than was Scotland or Ireland. It was the Mediterranean world of which Brodel wrote. And we've got ourselves into a muddle in the European treaties when we say that European countries are entitled to apply. Kindly explain to me why Turkey is a European country, but Morocco is not. Right? So Turkey is accepted as an applicant country to the European Union. Morocco has twice been refused permission to apply on the grounds that it's not a European country. Please explain to me why Turkey is more European than Morocco. I think that the cultural historical claim is extremely dubious. Then you might say, well, at least to the west it's well defined. Well, geographically, perhaps there's a good stretch of sea. But if we're talking about Europe as a community of values, of culture, of ideals, kindly explain to me why Turkey can belong to Europe but Canada cannot. I once wrote a column in The Guardian explaining why Canada is a perfect EU member, including, of course, Quebec, which it self-evidently is. I mean, if you go down a list of what most people in this room would talk about as European values, Canada will tick every single box, except being in the wrong place. And this goes to an important point, which is when we use a phrase like saying, we believe in European values, what claim are we making? We sometimes talk as if we are making the claim that these are exclusively European values. Empirically, that claim doesn't hold up for 2 minutes. There are many, many societies and many, many people around the world, notably in North America, but not just, who share many of these values. The second thing Europe clearly is some political project or set of institutions, at its heart, to be sure, the European Union, but not only the European Union. We forget about the Council of Europe, the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights, the OSCE, but actually, the Europe of values is originally and deeply anchored first in the Council of Europe and the Strasbourg Court, and to some extent in the OSCE. It's actually, and I'll come back to this, one of the fundamental problems of the European project, that the Europe of values and the Europe of money are divided. And then there's the Europe of NATO, let's acknowledge in some sense, the Europe of the Eurovision Song Contest, of the Europe of football, but various political projects and institutions. And then there's a third level at which we can meaningfully talk about Europe, which is Europe as an idea, an ideal, a state of mind, a philosophy. Some of you may have heard of one of the great Europeans of our time, who, as I was proud to call a friend, Bronisław Geremek. Does that name mean something to some people here? Bronisław Geremek. So Bronisław Geremek was the child of a rabbi in pre-war Poland. As a child, he was shut up with his family in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they managed to smuggle him out just in time. He was so thin that in the middle of summer, he recounted, he was wearing about 5 pullovers to keep him warm. And people in the tram looked at him rather oddly in the middle of August wearing 5, but he survived. His family were, of course, murdered in the Holocaust. Then he was adopted by a Polish Catholic family, so he had a dose of Polish Catholicism. Then he became a communist, joined the Communist Party in Poland. Then he became one of the key advisors of the Solidarity movement, starting in the Great Strikes of August 1980, and was actually one of the political minds of Solidarity all the way through to the Round Table of 1989, and he then ended up as the Polish foreign minister who signed Poland's accession treaty to NATO and a member of the European Parliament. A truly great European story of our time. And I have never forgotten Bronek turning to me one day. We were walking down the corridors of the Polish Parliament, and he turned to me and stopped and said, "You know, for me, Europe is something like a Platonic essence." It's an amazing moment. This man who had had so much of European history, for me it's something like a Platonic essence. And he believed in Europe in that idealistic sense. So geography, political project and institutions, idea and ideal. Who's the subject then in Europe telling the story? Who is entitled to tell the story to whom? If you want an example of how not to do it, may I commend to your attention a project which, I'm sorry to have to say, was sponsored by the European Parliament and led by European Commission President Barroso, called the New Narrative for Europe. And if you look on the website, or rather the 3 loosely interconnected and extremely unhip and clunky websites, you have a classic example of how not to do it. Absolutely de haut en bas, highly institutional, telling the story from the top down, teleologically. There's a declaration there called Mind and Body of Europe, which was initially to be drafted by a committee, but actually, there's a very good article that describes all of this, ended up essentially being drafted by one person. I believe her name was Nicola Settari. And it's not bad at all. Actually, it's quite good. But it's not the expression of any genuine dialogue, let alone a conversation with wider parts of European society. And Wolfram Kaiser, who writes a good article about it, says, it describes it quite well as an attempt to align collective memory. Well, whatever European narrative is about is not trying to align collective memory from above, from Brussels. Another scholar, Annabelle Litos-Monet, describes quite well the power struggles around the European narrative and collective memory, and in particular, in a way, the way in which, when the Central and East European countries joined the European Union in 2004, you get the memory wars, because West European memory has essentially been about the Second World War, but particularly about the Holocaust. And then the East Europeans come in and say, what about the Gulag? The West Europeans say Nazism and fascism, the East Europeans say, what about communism? And so you get a kind of balancing up in which we not exactly split the difference, but say, yes, we're going to take account of both, and some rather sort of loose highest common factor or lowest common multiple wordings about the sufferings of all parts of Europe, which seem to me really quite problematic. So to discuss, and I really would like to have a conversation with you about it, who is to tell this story? And in a way, this whole museum is about posing that question. Then, what story? Let me take those 2 words together. And the obvious question here is, why what story in the singular and not which stories in the plural? That must immediately have occurred to some of you, I bet, when you looked at the screen. Because, of course, everything about Europe is a dialectic of the single and the plural, the one and the many, unity and diversity. A friend of mine likes to say, and I think it's a lovely formulation, that the experience of being European is the experience of being at home abroad. That's a lovely phrase, and for me it captures it perfectly. Whether I'm in Prague or Budapest, Madrid, Lisbon, Rome, Brussels, I'm abroad, but I'm also at home abroad. But it still has that duality about it. So how do we go about this? Well, let's first of all spell out the sheer diversity of our diversity. So when you take your tablet round this museum, how many people have taken your tablet round this museum? Let's have a show of hands, please. Well, a lot of you still have a treat in store. Go get those tablets. Now, the tablet is amazing because there are no texts on the exhibits, and the tablet is in 24 languages. Chapeau bas. I don't know how you did it. But many people might object. Why only 24? What about my language? Where's Ruthenian or Ukrainian, or I don't know if it's in there, or many other languages? We may say it's the diversity of states, but how many states? Traditionally, we operate with the figure 28. Soon, I hope not to be 27. But why only 28? Why not the 47 of the Council of Europe or the 57 of the OSCE? I think on any realistic reading, there are roughly 50 countries in Europe who have a claim to belong to Europe. That's a realistic. But then again, why the states and not the nations? Not the same thing. I remember I once visited the unofficial government of Ruthenia. How many people have heard of Ruthenia? Hands up. Not many. Well, one day you may hear of Ruthenia. So Transcarpathian Ruthenia is a territory of a people called the Subcarpathian Rusins, who are mainly in the very, very westernmost tip of Ukraine, but also in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and former Yugoslavia. So they're scattered across 5 countries, called different names, using different alphabets in 5 countries. But they have an unofficial government, which is located, or was located, in a hospital in Uzhgorod. The prime minister was a surgeon. The Interior Ministry was his anaesthetist, and the foreign minister had bicycled over from Slovakia. And they told me about an organization called UNPO. Anyone heard of UNPO? Literally no. One person, that's very good. The Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organizations, UNPO. And there are, the Kurds are there, of course, Kosovo, which has now been recognized, and the Ruthenians. And it goes all the way down to peoples who no one might take particularly seriously. But of course, one thing liberals have never worked out is who actually has a legitimate claim to self-determination. I see Taya nodding here from the experience of former Yugoslavia. So why not nations? Why not regions? Why not cities? Why not minorities? What about the Roma? Arguably the most neglected minority in Europe by far. And for that matter, why not individuals? After all, we each have our own individual Europe. If you went along the row in which you're sitting, every person in that row would have a slightly different Europe. I identify myself as an English European. Sometimes that gets a laugh. But I am an English European, but my Europe is actually shaped as much by my experiences in Germany and Central and Eastern Europe as it is by anything I've experienced in England. It's shaped by the experience of living in East Germany and being spied on by the Stasi, by the Solidarność movement, people like Bronisław Geremek, Václav Havel, and the whole story of East Central Europe's transition to democracy and to the to the European Union. And then when we're talking about individuals, never mind the 500 million, or maybe it's 700 million, who would consider themselves to be Europeans, what about people in the rest of the world, many of whom have some ideas about Europe? They have Europes of their own, precisely because Europe, uniquely among the continents, went out to the rest of the world and, quote unquote, discovered it and then colonized it and shaped it so that there is no part of the world which is untouched by Europe. And that means that people in those parts of the world have their own ideas of Europe. Shouldn't we, in our own story, in our own understanding of Europe, take some account of the Europes of others, and particularly of the Europes of people whose countries we colonized and ruled and treated very badly for centuries? I once went to Missouri in the Midwest to ask people what they thought of Europe. And I went way out into the countryside, it's farming country, and nobbled farmers and said, tell me, what do you think of when I say Europe? And they had a bit of difficulty. One of them said wonderfully, it's a long ways across the pond. And another said, they have good hunting over there. But then they all had something to say about Europe. So in a sense, if we were really to be serious about thinking about European stories in the plural, we'd have 4 or 5 billion Europes, which is, of course, impossible to embrace. What is more, all these Europes are not fixed and static objects. They are constantly changing with time. Let me give you a little example from, I'm not sure if it's still in the exhibition, but I found it in the book about creating the exhibition. And it's a poster from 1970, a German poster, which shows a sort of film starlet, Europa, sitting rather happily on a bull with sort of high bodice and looking rather kind of Marilyn Monroe-like, and the bull kicking away the customs checks and customs barriers. And it's meant to celebrate the single market and kicking away the customs barriers. And upstairs in the museum, or is it downstairs, anyway, wherever it is, there are quite a few little Europas, the abduction of Europa. But I have to say, in the days of Me Too, I wonder if we don't actually look at those images a bit differently. An image like that looks to us like an image of sexual harassment. Zeus as the Harvey Weinstein of his day. So these images that we make and have are constantly changing. How do we address that? In the book about creating this museum, creating the House of European History, there's a very interesting essay by Andrea Mork, who is here, called The Narrative. And the way the museum goes at it, and I think there's a lot to be said for this, is saying there are common threads, shared experiences, be it Christianity, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Revolution, Industrialization, 2 world wars, but they're experienced by different countries and different regions and different religions and different peoples and different individuals in very different ways. And so that's how we get at the dialectic of unity and diversity, by showing those common threads, but how they're experienced very differently. And I think that's absolutely right, and is a key to, in my view, if I may say so, the success of this museum. But it doesn't quite get us to the point of what we want from a narrative. Because what we want from a narrative is something which brings us together a bit more, which is a bit more inspiring and uniting and motivating, without being completely mythopoeic and doing terrible damage to the historical facts. So let me, in the last part of what I want to say before opening it up, just try on you what seem to me a few threads on which we could genuinely build a European story. None of this is particularly new, but I think nonetheless it's worth thinking about. People often say, we can't do it anymore with the peace narrative. You must have all heard that said. The peace narrative is something from the 1940s and 50s, and now nobody believes in it. I don't buy that for a moment. Not for a moment. I think what you saw on Sunday, on the 11th of November, the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, was a great European moment, a great shared European moment. I mean, it remains true that Europe, today's Europe, has been built on the progression which goes from the experience of war to the memory of war, to the remembrance of war, which is something different from memory. For 3 generations, the European project, everything we have achieved in European cooperation, central of the European Union, but not just the European Union, has been driven by personal memories of war, Holocaust, Gulag, dictatorships of the right in Southern Europe, of the left in Eastern Europe. And I can testify to that. I mean, I told you the story of Bronisław Geremek. For someone like Bronek Geremek, that was self-evidently true. But from Churchill and Adenauer and Monnet and Schuman, all the way through to the generation of Kohl and Mitterrand, that was clearly true. But we no longer have that driving personal memory. A colleague of mine at Oxford, Peter Pulzer, who, as a Jewish child, his family got out of Austria just in time after the Anschluss, otherwise they'd all have been killed in the Holocaust. And he once said, only those who have lived in a police state can know what it is like not to live in a peace state, in a police state. And the historian Ian Kershaw adds, only those who have experienced war can truly know what it is like to live at peace. And I'm afraid that is tragically true of human nature. But the attempt we make as historians, as writers, as museum curators, is to try to learn from history without having to go through it ourselves. That is to say, remembrance rather than actual personal memory. And that's the gamble we're all taking. But let's not pretend that this is all about stuff which is 73 years ago. I've never forgotten spending time in Sarajevo in 1994, 95, 96. And in conversation, people would say things like, you know, before the war, or after the war. And if you're British, you immediately assume that must be the Second World War, because that is the war. There's only one war. And then, of course, I very quickly worked out that's not what they were talking about. It wasn't 1945, it was 1995. It was the wars in former Yugoslavia. As we sit here today, there is a war in Europe. In eastern Ukraine, there is a low-level war going on as we speak. People are being killed by grenades and mortars and tanks. And the guy who's really got onto this is Emmanuel Macron, one of whose most profound insights is that we haven't had 70 years of peace. It's complete nonsense. He said in his speech accepting the Charlemagne Prize, tell that to the Poles, tell that to the Czechs, tell that to the peoples of former Yugoslavia, tell that to the Spanish remembering the Franco dictatorship, tell it to the Portuguese, tell it to the Greeks who had the colonels. We haven't had 70 years of peace. That's a myth. And the lesson he draws from that is that we need to build Europe on the consciousness of what he calls le tragique de l'histoire, the tragic dimension of history. And I think that's absolutely right. So in my view, this much often dismissed peace narrative in this new form of an understanding of the tragique de l'histoire is one of the key European stories still. This leads to the second, as it were, gestalt, if I can put it this way, of European stories. If you look at the way the pro-European argument is made in the different member states of the European Union, at first glance it looks very different, but actually it has a similar form. The basic form of the argument is this: we have been in a bad place, we want to be in a better one, and that better place is called Europe, right? So Europe has no shortage of bad places. So we all have our different bad places. For the Germans, it was the shame of Nazism. For the French, it was a strange defeat and occupation and collaboration. For the Spanish, it was a Franco dictatorship. For the Poles, it was a communist dictatorship. For the Brits, it was relative economic and political decline. Different bad places, but the similar shape of the basic, the gestalt of the story. From a bad places to the good one, and the good one is Europe. But now we have two problems. Problem number one, what if we're in it? Right? So we've all got there, most of us at least, and we're in the European Union. Reality is never as good as the dreams, right? And so you have a generation of Europeans who, broadly speaking, have known nothing else, who take it for granted, and for whom that argument doesn't hold, particularly because they haven't had much history at school. So they don't know much about the bad places, let alone from personal experience. But it's actually worse than that, because if you're a young Greek, or young Portuguese, or young Spaniards, and maybe there's some in this room who can talk about it, you were actually in a better place 10 years ago. I mean, 2004, 5, 6, if you were in Athens or Madrid or Lisbon, it looked really great. It looked as if the promise of Europe was being fulfilled, there was growing prosperity, and Europe appeared to be converging. Those cities which in some sense, I mean, it's in a sense ridiculous to say that Athens was the periphery of Europe because it's the birthplace of Europe, but in some sense, for many, through modern history, had been in some sense on the periphery, felt they were converging with the core Europe. And then the Eurozone crisis hit, and people with PhDs from Complutense University in Madrid are working as waiters in London and Berlin. And things have got worse, not better. And what is more, what is to blame for things having got worse? Well, to some extent, Europe, at least in the form of the Eurozone. So that story, we've been in a bad place, we want to be in a better one, and the better one in Europe, doesn't have the traction that it had. Then there is, and this is my third, and this is in a way very obvious, but nonetheless, I think actually there's a lot of mileage in this. There's a way of telling the story of Europe quite simply as countries which, like tributaries of a great river, started in very different places, one up there in the hills, one in those hills, one over there, but from these very different places have gradually run together in our shared European institutions and above all the European Union. And I actually think that's a very good way to tell our European story, because it's absolutely compatible with the historical facts, as long as you don't present this in a teleological or determinist fashion, as a story of historical inevitability, of progress towards a telos of perfected European unity, from Charlemagne to the euro, and there's quite a lot of that about. And of course, again, there's a problem with this story, which is if Britain leaves the European Union, then that little tributary seems to be taking off from the river. Poland and Hungary today, I don't need to tell you the situation in those countries, Italy for that matter. I think one can quite seriously argue that we are at the moment in a period of European disintegration rather than European integration. And what we shouldn't have is any illusions about that. We shouldn't be telling any fairy tales about that. So I think that's a good way to tell the story, but we have to tell it honestly. And actually, the last chapter in the story, bringing us up to date, is not one which says, and so the great river of Europe flows on ineluctably and magnificently to the perfect sea of European union and ever closer union. It is, all those achievements are actually fragile and under threat, and we might all pass ways again. And that's the way I think you mobilize people, by precisely reversing the story. And instead of a story of inevitability, you have a story of fragility. Now, the last, or perhaps penultimate, thread I just want to dwell on briefly is one which a lot of you will be familiar with, because it's a way, the sort of new European narrative, a lot of people, I think, in this town too, try and tell it, which is about Europe in an increasingly non-European world, right? And I think there's a lot of truth in that. From roughly 1800 until about 1945, Europe was in some sense the center of the world. It was setting the agenda of world politics. We destroyed ourselves in what Churchill called the new 30 Years' War between 1914 and 1945. We dethroned Europe from that central position, but because of the Cold War, focused on Europe, and in particular on Germany and Berlin, divided Berlin, Europe was still the central stage of world history. So the Weltgeist, to speak with Hegel for a moment, was still in Berlin, not because we were making that history primarily, but because we were the central stage of that history. And so the way in this museum the story of European integration is told, which is between the stories of the Soviet bloc and the American-led Western bloc in the Cold War, is exactly right. That's how that story unfolded. But since the greatest moment of European triumph, 1989, and by the way, I think that's another European story that we could dwell on, so long as we recognize that it wasn't the norm but the great exception, right? Because the great mistake we made after 1989 was to believe that it was a norm, that things were going to go on happening like that. It was actually the great exception. But since 1989, 91, the end of the Soviet Union, we're no longer the central stage of world politics. The Weltgeist has upped sticks and taken a plane to Beijing, right? World history, in the Hegelian sense, is being made by China and the United States and perhaps India and perhaps Russia, much less by Europe, or by Europe only as one of the competing powers. And the argument, which I'm sure all of you will have heard, that in a world of giants we have to be a giant ourselves. That if we are to defend our own prosperity, our own interests, our own values, our own shared way of life, that sense of being at home abroad, we have to get together. So as to defend our interest against these external great powers, the Chinas and the Russians, and now under Trump, the Americas, who are merrily dividing and ruling, and quite successfully dividing and ruling in Europe. So that seems to me a persuasive story. But for the historian or the writer or those who are interested in the cultural dimension, we have, I think, to think about how we do it. Because what happened is this. For centuries, Europeans were mainly concerned with themselves. Then somewhere around, let's take an arbitrary date, 1500, we set out to what we call discover the world. You remember that? When I was an undergraduate at Oxford, we had actually a paper on the discoverers, right? And if you go to the, have any of you been to the Torre de Belém in Lisbon, which is the exit from the harbor of Lisbon, and it's actually very powerful. If you have a historical imagination, imagining these people sailing off into the unknown to discover the world. But, I mean, the world, by the way, didn't need to be discovered. It was already there. It knew it was there. But off we went and discovered it, and then we plundered it, and we conquered it, and we colonized it. So we had a very deep and complex engagement with the non-European world, but it was a colonial engagement. And then come 1945, decolonization through to the early 1960s, we turned inwards. We turned away from that whole past and in large measure also forgot about it. As individual countries and as a continent, forgot about our colonial past. And if you look at the way the European story was told in the 70s and 80s and into the 1990s, it was all about us. There was a New Yorker cartoon which I liked, which showed two middle-aged men at a cocktail party talking to each other with a glass of wine, and one is saying to the other, "That's enough about you, let's talk about me." And in a way, that's what Europe said to the rest of the world. That's enough about you, let's talk about me. So we were talking only about ourselves. The European story was about ourselves. And my argument is that now Europeans have to rediscover the rest of the world, but rediscover the rest of the world in a post-colonial and non-colonial way, in a different way. So I think that's a cultural challenge that goes with the geopolitical and geoeconomic narrative. I could go on. There are many other threads. What about Europe as a defender of shared values? If we look at what's happening in Poland and Hungary today, well, the problem there is that the EU as such, and the European Parliament in particular, and in particular the EPP, has not been a great defender of those values which it proclaims. And in fact, what we have seen is a rather lamentable divorce between the Europe of values and the Europe of money. The Europe of values, which is still seated in the Council of Europe and the Strasbourg Court, and the Europe of values which the EU has tried to, as it were, reverse engineer into the economic community, but we haven't actually succeeded in making the hard linkage so that how much money you get if you're Hungary or Poland depends on how much you respect those values. So actually, if you're Orban or Kaczynski, not to get too political here, you can actually bite the hands that feed you. And there are other narratives. Let me finish on this and throw it open for questions. On Sunday evening, the 11th of November, we had an informal dinner with the Brussels-based alumni of my college in Oxford, St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and we have Antonians everywhere in the European institutions, and we had a wonderful discussion in which I asked them, how would you want the European story to be told? And I think there were two common threads in their very different answers. One was the one that I've talked about a moment ago, namely it has to be about how we engage with the rest of the world. Not so much about ourselves, but about the rest of the world. And the other is it has to be personal and emotional. And this is where so much that, as it were, comes down from on high in Brussels fails, is in being personal and emotional, let alone poetic. For me personally, the emotional story of Europe is not about Britain. It is about how my friends in Central and Eastern Europe, between 1979 and 2004, 2007, brought together Europe and freedom. And whereas in the classic English Eurosceptic narrative, Europe and freedom are seen as counterposed, for us in East Central Europe and in Southeastern Europe, Europe and freedom marched together. Europe meant freedom and freedom meant Europe. And that for me is what really inspires me about the European story. And that's why I was so moved when on Saturday the 20th of October, I was one among 700,000 people on the streets of central London. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. The Duke of Wellington's house, wreathed, surrounded by European flags. 700,000 people turning out to demonstrate for Europe with banners proclaiming, fromage, not farage. And I like this one, it's very English. The EU is rather good. I love that, you know. Let's not go over the top here. The EU is rather good. And my favorite, freedom I will not give you up, but with the U written EU. So that's what I say, freedom I will not give EU up. And on that note, let me thank you all and throw it open, and I look forward to comments and questions. Thank you very much.